basic things for humans, like fine motor precision, are the most complicated computational tasks. And complicated things for humans, such as doing extremely large differential calculus, are simple to solve for computers. And so that's why I think it isn't super easy to make these analogies, and often it is somewhat misleading to analogize, artificial intelligence to natural intelligence, because the starting points are different and we get impressed with things that are difficult for us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you for joining us on Inside Policy, our in-house public policy podcast. It is my pleasure to welcome Ryan Khurana here to the show today. Ryan is currently a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation and Machine Learning, lead at Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment, MLSE. In this role, he's responsible for leveraging advanced analytics and machine learning technologies to enhance the organization's media production and fan engagement strategies. He has previously served as a research fellow at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute and associate editor at Palladium Magazine and chief of staff at Wombo Studios, Inc. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Peter.
So we are here today to talk about artificial intelligence, or as I sometimes like to say, artificial yes, intelligent no. We'll unpack that further. There's much warranted and unwarranted hype and concern alike for artificial intelligence in its many applications. It holds great economic and productivity promise as perhaps the fourth industrial revolution, as well as peril, with some speculating, of course, that we will enter the singularity and soon be replaced to perhaps more realistic, yet already present realities, such as those of job loss and transformation, and other threats to human well-being and dignity, for example, via the deployment of psychologically manipulative and addictive algorithms, to the effects on health and welfare from an omnipresent, technologically saturated and mediated environment in which we are all increasingly online and potentially disconnected from one another. So after having attempted to separate the reasonable from the unreasonable hopes and concerns, we'll look to the regulatory environment, in particular to Canada's Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and to how Canada may foster an environment conducive to innovation while enhancing human dignity. So lots to cover, Ryan, but I know you're up to the task. So before diving in, let's set the stage, make sure we understand our terms. Could you share your perspective on what artificial intelligence fundamentally is? How do you think it compares to the way humans approach problem solving and decision making?
Yeah, so as a field, right, artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, and most of the fruits of this field we don't call AI anymore. Because the second it just becomes acceptable, it's no longer AI, it's just part of computation, right? So the hopes, it's 1956 about the field gets kicked off, and the hope is to build machines that can think and reason like human beings, and that promise delivers a lot of an intelligence explosion, right? A lot of human tasks involve contributing with our reasoning abilities, some outputs. So before, a previous paradigm focused on the logical rules of human beings, right? So how do our brains structure thoughts? And most coding languages are the fruit of this, right? So the software that we use embeds expert knowledge with rules-based decision-making, and that no longer seems cool to us. It's not artificially intelligent because obviously our computers follow rules and can do complex calculations. We obviously expect the online chess player we're playing against to be better than us because it's a computer and we can set the difficulty. In the last decade or so starting in 2012, a new era of this research kicked off with what's called the deep learning revolution. So deep learning, Geoffrey Hinton just won a Nobel Prize in physics for his fundamental work on this back in the 80s. but it was only with the amount of data that was produced by the internet and the advances in computer hardware that the stuff became reasonable. And instead of following the logical rules of human brains, what they want to do is model the structure of a human brain, where it's a bunch of networks and neurons, and the connections between them produce some results. So the field has evolved into trying to, instead of modeling reasoning, modeling the human brain in the hopes that that produces intelligent behavior. And so, what do we mean by intelligent behavior? So, the fruits of these algorithms are essentially very good predictions. And before, AI is what would power your news feed on Facebook or your TikTok algorithm and the like, right? We also just expect that now, that whatever pops up, whatever ad we get, whatever video we see, or whatever post is there is one that's like suited towards us. But that kind of work has its foundations in AI research. Similarly, facial recognition was a big field in this, and now we unlock our phones using facial recognition, and it's kind of commonplace and it's not expected. So AI as a field is always just whatever's next, whatever we haven't solved yet. And the big thing that we're trying to solve right now, with the current era of research powered by something called transformers, is the ability to produce new content. And so that, be it a ChatGPT producing text that is similar to how humans would produce text, be that a DALL-E that produces images similar to how humans would do that, and then like things like Sora, which are producing videos similar to how humans would produce like animated videos. So this creativity is seen as a frontier of intelligence, and it's something we want algorithms to solve. But I think there's an illusion that is a much more unified, singular, objective field. I know there's a lot of incentive to make it sound like that, but really it is the process of giving computers the ability to execute tasks that we expect sufficiently skilled humans to execute.
Right. And you noted how at the outset it was focused on logical inference processes and building machines or algorithms, machines that run on algorithms, which are basically program scripts, to attempting to model the neurological structures, because maybe in fact some of our reasoning, not all, is due to the weighted relationships and the feedback loops between our neurological in our neurology. But of course, part of human cognition also involves the other inputs, right? Like sensory, motor, perception, and that sort of thing. Can you just back up before we move on to make sure I have a clear understanding of algorithm? What is an algorithm? Because an algorithm is really at the base, you could say, perhaps you'll correct me, of what's involved in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, well, algorithms are basically sets of rules for making decisions, right? Like that's the simplest way to say it. When you're a kid, most people learn an algorithm for solving a Rubik's Cube, where it's you keep doing these steps until the corners line up, and then you take another set of steps until all the faces line up, right? There are sets of rules to accomplish some outcome. Now, there's different types of algorithms. And so the previous era of AI, what we would call the expert systems era, thought algorithms were rules-based decisions. And this has like fairly ancient roots to it, right? Like Aristotle's logic is syllogisms. If I give you a series of logical statements, I can infer or deduce a conclusion out of them. And there was a view that that was, how human reasoning works, and is a part of human reasoning, but it's not all of it. What that reasoning does is anything that's deterministic. But there's so many things which aren't deterministic. They're probabilistic. We don't know exactly what the outcome is. And that's this new crop of having a process rather than a rule. It's all powered by statistical models. And that gives you an ability to adapt to changing environments where there's probabilities at work, not just rules. One of the best philosophers to read about kind of the limits of contemporary AI and the differences between different approaches is a man named Hubert Dreyfus, who passed away only recently, but his great book was called What Computers Still Can't Do. And it talks about the differences between something that takes the logical understanding and something that takes the more experiential environmental understanding. But those are still, as you mentioned, limited because human beings don't just take in our sense input and then follow logical rules. We also actually have very complex social rules. A human in a on an isolated island, like a Robinson Crusoe, does not develop the same civilization that we have. And given that most of our rules are governed by this social fabric, purely trying to model the brain alone or logical rules alone doesn't capture all of that extra information that's unbelievably critical. So those, to me, place fundamental limits on what AI can do. Obviously, there are people with different opinions, but an algorithm at its core is some like logical process to achieve an outcome, and that can be probabilistic, it can be deterministic. There's a variety of different types of algorithms.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So indeed, the algorithm is kind of like the engine, if you will, and fundamentally, it operates on a basis of axioms, which are basically definitions, posits, and algorithmic coefficients. So it is basically running a program. Once you program it, it can further refine within those parameters, and then how that feeds into intelligence. What I want to talk about next is intelligence. You might think of it maybe as an index concept, like a combination of things. And what's emerged, I think, in recent years in the field of AI is, well, AI can do a lot of these things well, but it doesn't have general intelligence. And obviously, as we've been discussing, intelligence has many components, which may include sensory motor perception and action, sensing, processing, computing, logical, and other kinds of inference. But and you were alluding to some philosophers in this field. I would think, according to many more reflective and philosophically sophisticated people working in the space, you recognize that intelligence involves the intellect abstracting formal features from an object of sense perception or a purely mental construct through the imagination. And crucially, the contents of this process of abstraction, they're not directly empirical. They can't be neatly traced to observable features of reality, which led many philosophers to speculate that the intellect is itself immaterial in a way. Aspects of consciousness, are intentional. So intentionality is aboutness. It's just the unique feature of consciousness that it's about other things. There's no other property of reality that has that. And so AI necessarily, without the property of consciousness, can't represent or be about anything else. The AI's algorithms with constraints to carry out functions, it can't abstract away, and so it lacks this property of intentionality, which I would think maybe is necessary for these further refined processes of inference and therefore intelligence. What do you make of this kind of argument?
Yeah, I think, well, so the definition of intelligence is kind of a moving target, and it always has been. Um, because not only has the capabilities of computation expanded to the point that intelligence is always a step further than what we can currently do, but also human intelligence has expanded. We understand things that we didn't understand before, right? IQs just keep rising generationally because the world gets more complex and you have to face types of problems you haven't faced before. But the ability to solve all of these problems, regardless of what you face, I think is typically what we refer to as intelligence. Not the knowledge of how to solve the problem, but the capability to pick up on what the problem is and how to solve it and like adapt, right? And those are kind of characteristic features. Um, I'm not sure about this intentionality idea because so abstracting away, I think, is a great kind of mark of like what separates human beings from non-human sentient creatures, right? Where you're able to show a child two almonds and then add a third almond and say two became three, and they know it doesn't just apply to almonds. They've learned these concepts now. They know what two is and they know what three is, and we can pick that up really intuitively to a degree that no other species can. But I think actually that's the fundamental capability computation has as a base. And so really it's the problems are the other way around. We get really impressed with computers because they can solve problems that are super complicated for a human being to solve and would take a lot of training to learn. But things that are super intuitive for us, that even a child can do, are complex for a machine. And that's because it's not grounded in the same world that we are, right? This is a world of bits versus the world that we inhabit, which is of atoms. They're fundamentally different. And so the term in computer science is called Moravec's paradox, which is, basic things for humans, like fine motor precision, are the most complicated computational tasks. And complicated things for humans, such as doing extremely large differential calculus, are simple to solve for computers. And so that's why I think it isn't super easy to make these analogies, and often it is somewhat misleading to analogize, artificial intelligence to natural intelligence, because the starting points are different, and we get impressed with things that are difficult for us, which doesn't mean they're not useful. Like the outputs of a machine that can do extremely rapid differential calculus is what got us to the moon, right? Like it's stuff that's super important, but it's not the same way of a child learning and being able to learn how to put a watch together, which requires very precise movements and all of that.
Yeah, what I find so interesting about that, I mean, that's so true that computers can do so many things much better than we can, yet they can't, the most basic things. And it really points to just how much we don't know about our own internal background cognition. Like we don't really know how it fully works, which is interesting. One more question for you on this topic before we move on to the policy and economic landscape, because I think from what I'm understanding of your accounting of where we are currently with AI, it's still fundamentally based on rules-based algorithms of different types and amalgamations there. And there's a theory put forward by Kurt Gödel. I understand it still stands, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's basically a proof that no formally consistent system can contain the proof of its assumptions, but it must find its proof outside of itself. And, artificial intelligence-based algorithms would be the same. They have axioms, they define all of their features, and then they deduce things from it. And he applies this to AI, arguing that algorithms can't be intelligent. So any attempt to conceive of the mind or of artificial intelligence in a mechanistic fashion like this, system with axioms whose algorithms constitute, the operations of the mind or computer, would be doomed to failure. It's because, as Gödel shows, formal systems can't always generate statements from their assumptions that follow from the rules of the system, but which the system can nonetheless not understand. So it almost shows as though formal rules-based inference is itself incomplete, and it relies upon something else for its own ability. So this argument is supposed to show that intelligence, as we understand it anyway, can't be that of this like formal rule-based inference. What do you make of that claim?
Yeah, I wouldn't. So contemporary machine learning approaches and like deep learning approaches aren't rules based, right? So that I think is a very valid critique against previous attempts, what I call the expert systems, or sometimes called symbolic processing. But the current crop of algorithms are not rules based. They're not trying to formalize concepts. They are probabilistic. And the root of it would be more in evolutionary theory than in computational theory. And that has problems of its own, but the the idea of a neural network is that if we model the structure and the growth process of a human brain, we can get a much better and more generalizable understanding similar to the brain, right? Similar to how it grows and evolves and processes more information, right? That's a very simplified view of like what the thesis is. And the learning mechanisms, right, from these have also their roots in evolutionary theory. One of the papers that Geoffrey Hinton wrote earlier in his career was on something called the Baldwin effect. And the Baldwin effect is an idea in evolution, which is that pure natural selection is not the only means by which new traits are acquired. Actually, it is learning over the lifespan of an individual in that species that is the adaptively beneficial trait. So the speed at which evolution occurs is justified on account of some learning process. And so that learning process is the thing that they're trying to encode. So by being more process-based and probabilistic, I don't think it falls under the same critiques as different paradigms, but there are critiques of their own for this, right? Because actually not all, like, I don't think probabilistic thinking alone solves all problems, because actually, like, there are deterministic problems, right? There's combinations of different things. And finding the right area in which these algorithms apply is a more near-term practical thing.
Yeah.
But I only think these things come into a real consideration when we're trying to ask questions of, is there a singular approach that can solve all classes of problems? And if you're trying to find that, like this holy grail one solution to everything, then you have to start reckoning with, okay, what are the limits of each? What are combinatorial things? There's work being done by like at DeepMind. They have their, so Demis Hassabis also won a Nobel Prize in chemistry because they developed an algorithm called AlphaFold, which essentially makes molecular biology an obsolete discipline. And then they have their algorithm called AlphaProof, which is one of the most advanced math proof solvers ever. And these are trying to reconcile limits of the more statistical and the more deterministic and try to combine them and like take advantage of it. But again, these are very specialized, particular applications, and they're not about generalizability. So I think at this stage, like there's such a myriad of approaches that the main takeaway to come away from is that there isn't one algorithm that everyone's working on. It isn't a one size fits all thing. And so we're not, like, a critique against one doesn't mean there's not another way to solve it.
That's
I know
fair. That's interesting. I think
Yeah.
just to take it back to what I think the core takeaway from that argument is, and it would apply, I think, to the deep learning based probabilistic types of inference, because ultimately those processes would be founded on sets of starting axioms and assumptions, and insofar as they are, I think it still applies, unless of course those are modified by inputs received through the process of learning. But I'd wonder if that's all derivative of the initial starting point or not. And so anyway, as you've said, lots still to uncover in this growing field. So let's turn now to some challenges and concerns from people in the public and public policy world. Automation. You've written extensively about the myths and realities surrounding automation and AI. Can you start by giving us a brief overview of how you see the current narrative around automation and why it persists despite its many failings?
Yeah, so I started my career doing this research, right? I wrote my dissertation on the economic impacts of AI. And for several years, I was just researching automation. And I came to the conclusion that, wait, AI is not making any economic impact at all. And so, why am I convinced of its importance and the world is not? So, I decided to move into industry. And then the world all did become convinced of its importance when ChatGPT came out a couple of years ago. So it's a very different world a few years later. Um, but like the fundamental claim that motivated me to move into industry is this idea that actually almost all of our investments in deep learning like based AI at a corporate level have been toy experiments, right? You spend money on your technical team to build something, and then very few companies actually adopt them at scale in a meaningful way outside of obviously in the tech sphere, right? Like I can't imagine TikTok existing without AI approaches, but like I can, most companies haven't been transformed that much, and so that really has impacted the economic lift. We notice this in the fact that productivity is still not rising. Like labor output per worker is pretty much stagnant. We don't see GDP growth as that much higher, right? Like the things that you would expect if these models were delivering the kind of economic fruit they were expected to, are just nowhere in the statistics. Um, and if anything, right, the fact that companies like TikTok are the best users of this, that might be actually a negative impact on productivity. Who knows? That like the fact that they're not being implemented well tells us there's some problems. And to me, one of the biggest problems is that you do not actually get fruits from a new technology until you remodel your processes around it. So there's a fantastic series of books by professors at the Rotman School of Management in Toronto, Agrawal, Gans, and Goldfarb. The first one was called Prediction Machines. And they came up with this fundamental model, right? That if we take all of our current deep like machine learning models, regardless of the era, but when they're learning based models, they're fundamentally prediction machines. Is their claim, right? They take input data and they make a prediction about an outcome. And in corporate processes, uh, decisions are really critical throughout. And they say decisions are a function of predictions and judgment, like a judgment call of like, what is the risk? What is our reward? Why are we doing this kind of thing? So if we decompose every step in a process that a company has into these decisions and isolate what's the predictive component and what's the like judgment component, you can redesign workflows in a much more efficient way by having all of the predictions produced by machines and having the judgment calls worked by human beings. This is actually a very complex thing to do. It's very easy to do in a purely tech industry. That's why a lot of the adopters of this are startups, and some of those startups hit it big and disrupt previous companies. But it's very hard if you have a large company with a large, capital intensive business process. So too much of the advancement, in my opinion, has been in the world of bits again, right? Like they're just software products alone, but not in the world of actual corporate management and like the production of actual goods. So going back to your statement about the overemphasis, like the narrative around it, however, and you see this all the time, is companies delivering what are not fully algorithmic based predictions but wanting to attribute them to an algorithm because it helps in a certain type of narrative about where these things are going. And it often also creates incentives to undercut wages or reorganize work, right? Like we have this transformation to gig work. We have a lot of these algorithms in the internet have dramatically increased the scale of outsourcing to lower income countries and the like. But so those narratives help management in a way, regardless of the actual productivity gain, create this sense of unease in their workers. And I think it's a more malicious way of putting it, but I think that is a very valid claim. My go-to comparison is if you look at the ATM is an example of how automation is actually job creating. Before, banks were these giant buildings, you had to wait in line for hours, and someone just counted your cash and updated a book. The ATM comes out, it updates my checking account, and it gives me my cash almost instantaneously. There are more bank tellers today than there were when ATMs started getting adopted because bank branches are now smaller, they're in a lot more places. Banking is a far more integrated part of your daily routine. And therefore, bank tellers can be there for all of the additional banking services that they can sell or provide and like support that they just never had the capacity to do before. So it's this productivity benefiting automation that actually created jobs. On the flip side, we have things like self checkouts. And I don't think self checkouts, at least personally, are productivity increasing. What self checkouts often do is they are a threat to the workers to not unionize and to not ask for better conditions because, hey, look, we have a machine that might actually be slower, that might be less efficient, but it tells you that you're not necessary. And so the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, I'm not mentioning many 2024 Nobel Prize winners, went to Darren Asanoglu. And Darren Asanoglu's done a lot of work about, how automation is dependent upon the productivity increase that is produced by the technology, which is actually a very reaffirming thing to say, which is that management has control. Humans have agency. We can choose how we want to implement technologies. And once we choose them in a way that benefits, right, that increases top line revenues, that introduces productivity, that introduces efficiency, everyone wins. But if it's done in a way that's like, I just want to save on costs, I just want to replace my employees, and it doesn't matter if it's better, if it's just good enough is all I need, that actually has a net negative to everybody involved.
So you've covered a lot here. I want to return to a few of them. So first on automation, I think what you were saying there is that if you just focus on the technology improvements, say AI-driven ones, you won't actually realize the productivity gains unless you're making a lot of other process changes to go with it. So where have you seen examples of success in this regard? Like what industries or fields?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're still in early stages, especially on the current crop of AI models. But like a process change that is in some way algorithmically mediated is to transition from traditional taxis to Uber. Um, like Uber is a system redesign and saying that the process of calling a taxi is inherently inefficient and that matching taxis based on algorithms is going to be more efficient. Um, and for almost a decade, it wasn't. They were subsidizing rides because the cost of maintaining and building effective routing was really, really capital intensive. Has the Uber experiment paid off? Like I use it. I think it is a net benefit to society. We'll see if it ends up being more economical in the long run. But that is a bet on redesigning a system around the promise of an algorithm rather than shoehorning it in. But to be honest, it's much easier for me to think of failures of redesigning systems than it is of because it's hard. It's a hard problem. It's not an easy problem.
Undoubtedly. Okay, so then let's talk about effect on workers when it's let's say net beneficial from a because when you see we look back to the other industrial revolutions, there's been a lot of disruption, a lot of job loss, but because productivity has in net risen, as has our wealth, they've given rise to new jobs, more earning potential for everyone ultimately in the long run. And so you want to see the same thing here. Can you say some general things about how AI is or can be deployed in ways in various industries, such that it has, a disruptive, yes, but net beneficial impact on economic growth, productivity, and also creates new jobs?
Yeah, I think going back to what I said about the ATM, when automation decisions or like the decision to replace an existing manual process with something that's more model mediated, if it has the intention of growing top line revenue or growing productivity, that helps in designing it in such a way that it's beneficial for all. Because when you're trying to just eke out efficiencies without increasing output, that's where it's we're all competing for the same sized pie rather than making the pie bigger. So the growth in revenue is like a key target there. And where does this manifest? I see right now, right? I work in the entertainment industry because I do think that that's a place where early benefits are easier to test and realize without an unbelievable amount of risks. Like if I was working in the healthcare or finance space, things would be moving much slower and justifiably so, right? But in the entertainment space, I can give you a comparison between, you know, doing something where you need a fixed amount of faster. That doesn't necessarily increase, but with things like social media and the like, if I can give better analytics, if I can make the process of producing content faster, what's the output? More content is produced, right? There's more things that the employees have to do. And if the assumption is, and this has proven to be an assumption in many places, that wait, when you produce more content, you're not cannibalizing the value of everything else. You're actually just getting more people to spend time on it, spend more money on it. So producing more is net beneficial. What does that mean? All of my employees working faster and producing more because they're more efficient. Actually, I need even more of them because I'm realizing the returns to my content are higher as a whole. So that's like an entertainment example. But in any space where you can say the production of more things means that actually the demand also increases because you're getting more things cheaper, people want more of it. Like that's places where algorithms help. And for more like you may say kind of socially problematic ones, like this is how all of our like social media apps function, right? They are using models to recommend us the best content that's most engaging so that we spend more time on their products, right? That does not automate away their jobs. That creates a huge demand for more jobs, right? Because you actually need to create more content now, far more content than ever before, so that you can satisfy this increasing demand for content. So that's like the entertainment space is the one that I focus on the most. So that's the one I can tell that whether the fact that we're spending, 8 hours a day consuming content is great, who knows? But like, there's a fair argument that it's not, but that model can be applied to other industries.
I think that's a really great insight, and it jives with common sense and even moral thinking alike. It's almost as though if your purpose is to grow and be able to provide more economic benefit alone, then the result of your deployment of technology will be net welfare enhancing in that way. Then, like any other industry or service, if what you're ultimately providing is not good for people, like tobacco or trying to have people chained to their desk or looking at their phone 8 hours of a day, then it may have some economic benefits, but the net social may not be so good. But that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the technology in play. It's all the service it's being put to. So I think that's really insightful. Let's now talk about Canada's AI strategy. With the recent introduction of the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, we've seen some divergent responses. I know you were involved in making some recommendations in its development. Some appreciate its breadth, while others think it will stifle innovation and it's overregulating. There are examples like in California, where the AI regulation is done in a way that's more industry specific and not overly broad. So, what do you make of Canada's approach as it stands at present? It's proposed, it has been enacted, and how can it be improved upon?
Yeah, I think so. One thing to note in 2015, we had our pan Canadian AI strategy announced, I believe. And then, like, by 2017, funding was super rampant in Canada. We were a really early player, not only in the research, like Hinton being here and a lot of the people who wrote the paper that powers modern LLMs and GPTs are Canadian. Um, the chief scientific officer who was on the founding OpenAI team did his PhD at U of T. Like, we had a lot of early starts and we had a lot of early political investments in this technology. But it's gotten to the point that we're lagging behind. Like, the recent Stanford Index no longer places Canada as an AI leader. I don't know if our funding is being used as effectively as it could. And we, as a country, face a drain problem generally, that once you reach a certain level of success, our neighbor to the south typically offers you a much better pay and much more, innovation friendly ecosystem. The This is disappointing to me that our early lead has been allowed to erode a little bit. And with this regulation, it signals a little bit of a shift in priority, where Canada's goal is to be a leader more on like safety and regulation topics rather than in the technology itself. I wouldn't blanketly claim that it's just a purely problematic regulation. It's nowhere near as bad as some of the things that are being proposed in Europe and have been enacted in Europe, uh, where aside from one great company in France, there is no real AI innovation across the entire European Union. But it is a very different approach than what's being taken in the United States, even in a place like California, which typically does regulate quite heavily. Some of the issues, and as you noted, are with breadth. To me, it doesn't really make sense to regulate AI applications, because the misuse of applications are typically regulated by the industry themselves, right? So if I'm regulating AI applications in finance, typically the harms I'm trying to reduce are already things that financial regulations cover. And similarly, your fiduciary duty to your patients in healthcare cover some of these things that would be the outcomes of algorithmic decisions. So by adding specific onerous to the use of AI instead of the business logic in finance or in healthcare or all these other industries, you're creating a chilling effect. Like, they're going to be much more risk averse to adopting it, and they probably already were risk averse to begin with, right? Because they are industries. Now, if you regulate just the technologies used, so the focus of like the California regulation was a lot more on large models, right? The kinds of things being produced by the OpenAIs and the Anthropics, and allowing a lot of leeway for, small companies to keep experimenting and have less onerous regulations, allowing for, industry players to test and not be, encumbered too heavily. That makes sense, because if your belief is at least the most cutting edge, the most well invested models starting to pose risks, I want those models, I want the use of them to be done safely. But that's not all that's out there. And so treating AI quite broadly might discourage applications even when it's good. And the other quite unique thing in AIDA, and I'm not like a legal expert, but the definitions of harms have been quite broad, and the liability are very targeted. So that's like, even if I can't, predict, and I understand like there's an incentive to be a little bit broad because I can't predict all the ways a model may fail. Like, we can think about it in things like credit scoring. Like, I don't want to reject someone unjustly and not be able to give them an explanation. But but that's a super like specific use case, and the government obviously doesn't have the capacity to think about all the potential ways these things could fail in the future. So they want to keep it a little bit broad. But if I give you a targeted liability to a technical team without specifying exactly what that harm is, I'm making you as an engineer always be anxious that, oh, what if this thing goes wrong? I don't think that risk first mindset is great. I think risk is something to be avoided in large scale applications where a lot of people are impacted. But when you're starting to build something, your concern should be, let me build the best thing, not what are all the ways that this could go wrong and maybe I shouldn't start working on it.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, obviously, there are already so many applications and uses of AI, but as you've suggested, so much is like almost yet to be realized, and it's like we're regulating for what is not yet here, and that is going to have the effect of stifling innovation. Um, Final question for you, Ryan. Let's take an example of one challenge that we know already exists. I've alluded to it already. Many of the algorithms, associated with attention economy, keeping people's attention fixed on a product, are known to be psychologically manipulative and addictive. So maybe that's one area where I don't know if you have some thoughts about how that might be regulated. But then in general, what would you leave us with an approach to regulating the industry in a way that it's mindful of some concerns like this, but really promoting innovation?
Yeah, so even with the use of models to target content, there's typically direct harms we're trying to avoid, or people that we believe shouldn't be on these sites, right? Like Australia just passed a ban on teenagers' access to social media. I'd say maybe there is a valid claim that, okay, young people are at far more risk of the detriments to being on TikTok all the time than someone who's like 40 and has had time to mature and make decisions for themselves. Like that seems reasonable to me. I don't know if we want to go as far, but like some restrictions on younger people make sense. Some restrictions on you are not allowed to include the targeting of pornographic content or gambling content. Like this makes sense to me, and I think a lot of these companies already kind of have a corporate incentive not to promote that, but it's smaller ones do, right? And like that might be something you want to target and root out. So the application can have regulations on it. That doesn't mean you govern the underlying technology the same way. Uh, you should be trying to avoid very particular harms. Um, there might be harms introduced by bias, but like you should specify what those harms are. That's my kind of general approach. Like when there are noted harms, try to regulate them away. But in a broader model, if you're talking about the technology where it is evolving fast, where there are kind of harms such as existential risks that we haven't fully come to grapple with, I think California provided a great model. Some places there, the legislation went too far, sure, but the idea of regulating compute, the thing that's used to build these models, and requiring things based on people who have access to the largest amount of power, like computing power, to create really cutting edge, forward thinking things, you want them to be subject to rules that someone who is building it for his startup does not really need to care about. Um, so it almost seemed to me they were regulating the access to and control of large amounts of computing power, similar to mid-century regulations of telecom networks. These are private companies, but it is in the public interest that they do some things well, and only when they're at a certain scale and a certain size do we care about this. And I think that's valid. I think actually the implications of what OpenAI is capable of doing is very different than some open source startup and what they're able to build. And so does OpenAI need some more scrutiny? They might be getting to that point where you require it because they so much runs on their infrastructure. Um, a lot of US regulation seems to be turning towards that infrastructure play, right? Like you have the CHIPS Act, you have the concern about computer chips, concern about access to this. And so that twin goal of kind of regulating is almost an AT&T in the 1950s, the really, really large players, and democratizing access to small players in the public interest. Like those need to be accomplished simultaneously so that we're safe, but we're also not, holding ourselves back.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, learned about what intelligence is, what it's not, what we don't know about it, and about the algorithms underlying its use in artificial intelligence, about the prospects for greater innovation and productivity, how it's not yet realized that due to some misapplications. And so I thought that was really insightful. An approach that focuses on known harms and is not overly broad and is open to the innovative potential that AI has. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Inside Policy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.